All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. We've got to untangle the chaotic live updates surrounding this potential US-Iran peace agreement. Over the last few days, we've seen an absolute whirlwind of diplomatic maneuvering, military strikes, and heavily contradictory statements coming out of Washington and Tehran. It's a lot to process, but that's exactly what we're here to do.
To make sense of all these fast-moving events, we've structured this explainer into 5 quick chapters: the 105-day war, the anatomy of the deal, the tale of two narratives, the regional ripple effects, and finally, the global economic impact.
Chapter 1, the 105-day war and the blockade in the Strait of Hormuz. Let's ground ourselves in the high-stakes reality of this conflict.
It's honestly incredible how fast we've moved from the outbreak of war in late February to the precipice of a deal right here in mid-June. By April, the U.S. had already initiated a strict blockade on Iranian ports. That rapidly escalated tensions in what is literally one of the world's most critical maritime bottlenecks. The pace of this geopolitical crisis has been nothing short of blistering. 141. That's the staggering number of commercial vessels the U.S. Central Command has redirected since this blockade on Iranian ports began. This is not just some hypothetical standoff, right? We're talking about a highly active, daily military operation to choke off unauthorized transit.
And the sheer scale of the disruption is just immense. U.S. forces are actively disabling non-compliant ships using rockets, and they're intercepting multiple one-way attack drones that Iran launched to target commercial ships. So the U.S. has made it abundantly clear they are strictly enforcing this blockade, even if it requires lethal force.
Chapter 2, Anatomy of the Deal. What's actually on the table? Let's see how this builds into the proposed Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding.
The crucial point to understand here is the purely transactional nature of the deal. On one side, you've got the U.S. wanting a 15 to 20-year lockout on Iran's nuclear enrichment, the immediate reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, and access to retrieve and destroy what President Trump called buried nuclear dust. In exchange for all of that, Iran is demanding the release of massive frozen assets, a complete lifting of the U.S. naval blockade, and compensation guarantees for damages caused by U.S. and Israeli strikes.
Now, if this memorandum is actually signed, it doesn't just instantly solve everything overnight. Instead, the initial agreement kicks off a 60-day ceasefire window. Based on the reporting, this is when the highly complex technical details of dismantling Iran's nuclear program will actually be negotiated. It's essentially a pause to let the real diplomatic heavy lifting begin.
So what's the major carrot for Tehran to agree to this pause? $24 billion. That is the massive amount of frozen assets that Iranian state media says would be released under the agreement. It provides a huge, badly needed financial incentive for their economy. In fact, reports suggest half of that could be released right as the 60-day ceasefire kicks off.
Moving on to Chapter 3, a tale of two narratives and the disconnect between leaders, because here's where things get really complicated.
Looking at the American side, President Trump is projecting absolute confidence. He posted claiming a great settlement has been reached, stating as a matter of fact that it will be signed on Sunday and that the Strait of Hormuz will be reopened immediately. So the message coming out of Washington is that this is, for all intents and purposes, a done deal.
But then, in stark contrast, Iranian officials are heavily pumping the brakes. A spokesperson for the Iranian Foreign Ministry explicitly stated they haven't reached a final conclusion, and a Sunday signing? That simply will not happen. They are urging extreme caution and pointing out what they call the contradictory positions of the United States. So, depending on who you ask, we're either days away from permanent peace or we're miles away from a basic draft. The two nations are publicly disagreeing on literally the most critical terms. The U.S. claims nuclear enrichment is ending permanently and that dust will be removed. Meanwhile, Iranian state media is telling its citizens that Tehran is going to negotiate to maintain its current position on the right to uranium enrichment. It's a fascinating, if maybe slightly alarming, disconnect. Caught right smack in the middle of this messaging war is Pakistan, acting as the lead mediator. And they remain incredibly optimistic. The Pakistani mediators have been actively preparing for an electronic signing ceremony, stating that finalization is likely expected in the next 24 hours. It's quite the diplomatic triangle. Chapter 4. Regional ripple effects and a tangled web of conflicts. Why does this bilateral treaty matter to the rest of the world? Well, because the Middle East is a tangled web of alliances. Israel is currently fighting the Iranian allied group Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the IDF is issuing ongoing evacuation orders. And here's the sticking point. Iran insists that any peace deal with the U.S. must include an end to the fighting in Lebanon, but Israel refuses to withdraw from its Lebanese buffer zone.
And these ripples extend way beyond the Middle East. The blockade has ignited deep anger in South Asia, specifically after 3 Indian mariners were killed. This happened when U.S. strikes disabled an oil tanker that had ignored repeated commands to turn back from the blockade.
India is absolutely furious. They've summoned the top U.S. diplomat for the second time in a week to lodge a strong protest over the deadly strikes. Their Ministry of External Affairs called the actions unacceptable, stating they undermine the safety and stability of international maritime commerce. It just highlights how dangerous enforcing this blockade has really become. Finally, Chapter 5, the global economic impact, with markets on edge. Let's look at how these geopolitical ripples are hitting the global economy. It all really comes down to geography and supply. Before the war broke out, roughly 20% of the world's entire crude oil supply passed straight through the Strait of Hormuz. When that strait is restricted or closed due to conflict, it creates a massive economic bottleneck that hits everything from fuel to food prices globally.
Because of this, the oil market has been on a wild roller coaster. Back in February, before the war, oil was sitting under $70 a barrel. By the April peak, during the height of the blockade fears, it skyrocketed to over $110. Now, in mid-June, prices have plummeted back under $85 as the market starts pricing in the optimism of a peace deal. In fact, we saw an immediate 4% drop in oil prices on Friday alone. That sudden dip was a direct market reaction following President Trump's remarks about a breakthrough in negotiations. The markets are just incredibly sensitive to every single headline dropping right now.
So, Wall Street and global markets are basically holding their breath. The Wall Street rebound continues with S&P 500 futures rising 0.6% and Dow Jones futures adding 0.7%. They're rallying on the hope that the strait reopens and that the intense global inflationary pressures brought on by this war finally start to ease up.
So, after covering the war, the proposed deal, the discrepancies, and the economic fallout, I'm going to leave you with this final thought to ponder. With such vastly different narratives coming from Washington, who says it's practically a done deal, and Tehran, who insists nothing is finalized, will the ink dry on Sunday, or is this ceasefire just a diplomatic mirage? Thank you for walking through this explainer with me. Keep a close eye on the news, because the answer to that question is going to impact us all.